welcome back to another episode of Child Please Podcast. I am Regina Weathersby,
And I'm Erica Simpson.
and this is episode one, two, three, third episode. So happy you all are joining us today. It is June. It's the month of Juneteenth
Yep.
on the 19th, and we're going to just have to get into this conversation. So, we know that as it relates to Black maternal health, there are so many different aspects, but we can't even begin to talk about like where we are now without looking at how history has got us to this point, right? So when we think about medical practices, we think about slavery and just all the things through all the years. When we look at statistics now, it's a direct impact from what's happened before. So, Eric, I know you've been diving into books, reading a lot, getting a lot of information, a lot of historical facts about what's happened as it relates to gynecology and how Black women, specifically during slavery, have contributed, not willingly,
Yeah.
to this area. Talk to us. Talk to the people. Tell us.
So yeah, like Regina said, I've done a lot of research, and as you know, there is very minimum Black doctors in gynecology, but gynecology birthed out of slavery. One of my areas that I read in was about Dr. Marion Sims, who was a doctor who relocated here to Alabama, Montgomery. And he was a prominent doctor, especially prominent amongst the slave owners because he practiced procedures on enslaved women without any medication, without any pain medication. And honestly, now, even though we are not enslaved, some of those practices still exist. Like I said, just looking back over the experiences that I had with childbirth and just appointments and things, a lot of times I feel like our symptoms are minimized compared to others. When we complain of pain or we complain of discomfort, is often brushed off until it's a dire situation. And so I just kind of feel like, I don't know.
Yeah,
it's just it's heavy, and like a lot of times when I go into doctors' offices, when you go into clinics and hospitals, when you walk around and you see the portraits of physicians on the wall, they're all white physicians, and it's like they look like ghosts to me. You know, it's like walking in a horror movie sometimes.
And I think that you can't ignore a system that's been built on distrust and mistreatment and then just expect a change to happen. You can't expect for people to just get over it and pretend like the past didn't happen. I'm familiar with some information on Marion Sims. And I know that there were times where he even boasted about being wealthy. But I think on the other side of that, for the slave owners who utilized him, because Black people weren't seen as fully human, they were protecting their assets. Because if I can get you as my slave to produce children, then I can have more slaves.
Correct.
You know, and so they didn't care about what people went through. They wanted the outcome. So if you got a doctor coming in saying, hey, I can fix this issue or I can do surgery on this person, they don't care if you have anesthesia or not. I cannot imagine that level of pain. First of all, I don't want a paper cut.
Correct.
Don't cut me with no paper. Right? So I don't want a paper cut.
But now that you say that you don't want a paper cut, I feel like now, post slavery, that's what's used to cut us. It's the paper. It's because it's the documentation that's put in our medical records to portray us of who we are. And so a lot of times that cuts deeper than a scapula, because when I go see this new doctor, they already have a perception of me. So we've gone from the knife to the paper to literally cut.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about the slaves and their assets, in slavery time, women were forced to reproduce. So now, even today, that stigma of us being hyper fertile still exists. When in actuality, Black women are, I want to say my research says 2.5% less infertile than their white counterparts. So, but you pulled up an article when we first got in here, and let's read it and kind of like go through it.
So this was an article that I was just kind of reading through, and it's actually an article from Yale School of Medicine. And then it just says that Black women continually fight for the freedoms to bear or not bear children, to give birth as they please in a safe and informed manner, and to raise those children as they see appropriate. And there is a deep mistrust in the U.S. medical system, rightfully so, which has not prioritized their lives and well-being, and has actively harmed Black women through forced sterilization as well as experimentation. So there's a history of violence and mistreatment that's present at medical appointments, during pregnancy, labor, and in deliveries. So it's almost like when I hear that, I think about domestic violence. If you have already historically violated me, historically, if you have abused me, if you fought me, if you have not considered my life, if historically you've killed me, then how am I to trust you now? And so it may not be me, of course, that you kill. It may not be me personally that you abuse, but when I look back and all I see is a trail of blood and sorrow and hurt, then how can I now look back at that? I don't have a reference point to trust you.
Correct. But even you said getting pregnant during pregnancy, but I know we don't really want to talk about it, but postpartum, that's a big piece too, that with all of that trauma, it's kind of like once we have the baby, it's like we dropped off on the island, and there's nothing, there's not a community around us. So even back in slavery, when we were forced to reproduce, what have you, I read a lot of articles about midwives and midwifery. And when a midwife was involved, most times the mom and the baby lived. But as slavery went on, they began to abolish midwives. And so that person that we trust, that community that rallied around us, again, was severed. And so me and you also talked about that too. We're going to fast forward to today's society. And then we look at so many mothers and their children have severed relationships because it's rooted in what happened in the past. It's a generational curse.
Yeah.
That hasn't been broken. And I think for it to be broken, I think the oppressor and the oppressed have to come together.
Absolutely. I agree 100%. Even when we were talking about the article about the slaves having to, instead of nursing their own baby, they had to nurse the child of the slave owner. So what that's communicating is this child is more important than my child. there's a bonding that happens with that. Mm-hmm. And when you don't get the opportunity to do that, then you created a bond with someone else, but it's different. It's not parent child. You know, that child has been elevated above your own. And so even situations like that affect the bonding, through the years. And then you operate as a machine. So there is not like, oh, me and my husband want to have a child. It's not that. The idea of having a child is not always pleasant for a slave. It's a forced thing. I might not want to do this again, but I don't have a choice because I got to have a child for them every 2.5 to 3 years for my own survival. For me to continue to be an asset here and not cause harm on myself, I have to continue to do this whether I want to or not. And so sometimes I think there's probably even a disconnect with the child because this wasn't something I necessarily wanted to do.
Yeah, and when you said that about breastfeeding, it reminded me of, I think it was our first episode, you talked about when you lost the twins and the hospital called you and asked you, could they use your breast milk for somebody else?
Yeah.
And so, forget my children ain't here, but can we use your milk to raise somebody else's child? Yeah. And 9 times out of 10, it was somebody's white child. And a lot of times too, I think too when you talk about society now, I think that's what it's. Let me see how I can word this. Like when people ask you when you get married, or when y'all gonna have kids? I mean, is it that you really want us to have kids, or is this this slave mentality? That's what I'm supposed to do.
And just to go off a little bit, the topic, that is not the right question to ever ask anybody. Don't ask people when they're going to have kids because there's so much involved in that you just don't know. I think that's a very inappropriate question. I think that's a very personal question. And I know people want to see people with their little family makeup. You want to see a little perfect little family situation happening. But I think sometimes people don't know the hurt that the person they're asking that question to has to deal with after that. You don't want to have to keep answering that if there are issues going on. You know what I'm saying? Or if you've had a child and had a loss, or if you've had multiple miscarriages, it's just never the right. Don't ask the question.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm sorry. I just had to address that. I was feeling it. I had to address it. But it's so much. And I think that we would not be doing the right thing if we didn't acknowledge that in all of the hurt, in all of the death, and all of the loss that happened, we would not have gynecology for any woman if you did not have the sacrifice of the bodies of Black women. Yeah. And so I think that is something to be recognized. I think that's something to be honored. I know for you and I both, the goal is not ever to create division. It's not to say Black over here, white over here. What we do want to do is bring awareness to what's happened. And so when we look back over time, we see the statistics for Black women in maternal health, they're not improving. It's not improving over time, but it's not improving because we're not acknowledging the truth. Like you got to be able to, that's even in recovery. We see for people, alcoholics or people who struggle with alcoholism, or you got to acknowledge that it's a problem first before you can start to address it. And so when we don't acknowledge that there was a problem, and so a Black woman may not feel comfortable coming into your doctor's office, and there needs to be some reassurance, not only in word, but in action.
I remember I used to love me some Iyanla Vanzant, but she said this one thing: you can't heal what you can't speak.
Yeah.
And I feel like we as as a people, not just Black women, as a people. Like, the trauma happened, let's move on.
Mm-hmm.
And like, we pick up and move on. Like, I remember you said you
just went on back to work.
You went back to work. You went in for your ultrasound. There's no heartbeat. You packed your stuff and went back to work.
Yeah.
I remember when I was in the process of IVF before I had Marley, the round before I had her, I had an embryo, and it was the only embryo, and they were like, I got an email. It's abnormal. And like I said, it goes back to the paper. Like, you hadn't cut me with no knife, but your words, you put in an email that the embryo that I was banking on to have was abnormal. Do you want to talk to the doctor? Let me know what you want to do. Like, well, damn. Like, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I was at work.
Yeah. It's a lot.
It is.
It's a lot. This is a topic that just goes and goes and goes, and it's worth talking about. It's worth having ongoing conversations about, even outside of this platform with us, but just being aware. Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? As Black women, doing your own research, about who your medical provider is, the history of that person and that practice. You need to know who you're dealing with. Mm-hmm. Having an honest conversation with your doctor about what your concerns are, because I think the bottom line is, if you are in a position to see all parts of me and I can't have an honest conversation with you,
that's the problem.
Then I need to find somebody that I can have an honest conversation with about my concerns and what's going on with me. Because you can't be that involved in my life and me not be able to communicate with you. And literally, there are times where my life is in your hands. Mm-hmm. You land on that table for a C-section. Your life is in somebody else's hands at that point.
Literally.
Because you just cut open in that procedure. And so I think that it's worth us having historical facts, knowing what's happened, being aware, so that we are conscious and diligent about how we handle our little babies, how we care for them. You know what I mean? Our own reproductive health, the conversations that we have with our doctors, so that we can feel as comfortable as we can in those situations. I think it's about being just self-aware too, because sometimes we carry things that we don't know that we're carrying, kind of like a trauma that's been imposed on us, mm-hmm. even though what our experience has been imposed on us and we carrying it. And so just acknowledging that, I think, is important.
And I'm glad you say that, because recently my baby has been sick. And like I said, she's my only child. And, and I know the community. Mm-hmm. Everybody want to help. Everybody want to.
Oh, yeah.
But
we're going to tell you what to do with your baby.
Correct. And sometimes I'll be honest, I have to check me, because like I said, the experience that I went through with having her. So, like, you can't tell me nothing about her now.
Right.
And it's like, and to some people, I may be overreacting. But again, I think people always look at what's going on now. But it's everything, every behavior, every action is based on the history. And like I said, even in the doctor's office now, like, I've taken her in the last 2 or 3 weeks, 2 or 3 times to the doctor. But I'm going to keep taking her until I get the answer that I want to hear. Mm-hmm. And again, like I said, some of it may be overreacting. But again, I know the experience that I've had. Mm-hmm. Just trying to get her here. And I feel like, as a grown person, as a social worker who works in healthcare, if my concerns have been ignored, clearly a baby who can't advocate for themselves concerns will go unheard. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I just kind of wanted to put that out there, and I feel like sometimes even with supporting people, like, we have to be mindful and considerate of things and how we tell people how to handle stuff, because you don't know my story. Yeah. I don't know your story, and I don't know. It's just a lot.
Yeah, it is a lot. It's so much. And so we just encourage everybody to get the facts, know what's going on in the history, not just on this subject matter, not just on Black maternal health, but just in general. It's worth knowing if we really want to move forward, if we really want to see progress, if we really want to see healthier communities, healthier families, healthier babies, healthier women. If we want women to live, it's worth knowing, because then when you know, you can do something about what you know. But if you act like it doesn't exist, if you act like things didn't happen, if we want to act like it didn't happen, we can just remove gynecology. If we're gonna act like it didn't happen,
right.
Because we wouldn't be where we are now, the advancement in medicine that we have, without, like I said before, those experiences by those Black women who were enslaved. And so,
and I think before we close out, it's being at Juneteenth, I don't want to leave out the Black men.
Yeah.
And the sacrifices that our Black men made during slavery, being separated from their wives being subjected to being raped and being made to reproduce by slave owners, what have you. So, and that's a whole nother conversation.
I was about to say, don't get me started on even just men being forced to reproduce. And so we look at men now and the mentality that they have around the treatment of women. When we look at our culture, you can't look at today without, where did that come from?
Yeah.
We can't do that. Well, it's not enough time for it today.
So, but like I said, I just still want to honor our Black men and the sacrifices our Black men made in history. So I think we're gonna close this up.
Happy Juneteenth.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for your support, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you. Bye-bye. And welcome